The fields of Tennessee go quiet in October, not peaceful quiet, the other kind. The kind that sits on a man's chest at night and reminds him of everything he hasn't said. For 3 years, Reed Harlow kept his head down and his hands busy. Fixed everything on the land, fixed nothing inside himself, and every night, without deciding to, he looked across 2 dark fields at the only light still burning. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself that a lot. Then one cold morning a brown hen crossed a fence line she had no business crossing, and the woman who came to collect her said something so simple, it broke something loose in him that 3 years of silence had kept sealed. Sometimes a line is just a line. Doesn't mean you have to stay on your side of it. He didn't know it yet. But the longest distance he would ever travel wasn't across those fields. It was the distance between what he felt and what he was finally going to have to say out loud. The light in her kitchen window was on again. Reed Harlow noticed it the way he'd been noticing it every night for 3 weeks. From his porch, from the yard, from the cab of his truck after he pulled in and sat with the engine off for no particular reason. A small yellow glow across 2 dark fields, warm and steady, the only lit thing in that direction after 9 o'clock. He didn't know what she was doing over there. Canning, maybe. Working the books for her market stand. Sitting at the table with the radio on. It didn't matter. He looked anyway. Then he went inside and told himself it was nothing, just a neighbor's house, just the natural awareness of a light in a dark field. Nothing that needed a name. He'd been telling himself that for 3 weeks. He was getting less convincing. It had started. All of it had started. Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of September, the east fence line, a roll of new wire, a thermos of coffee sitting forgotten on the tailgate. The fence needed work. 3 years of Tennessee winters had done what they always did. Rusted the wire through in 2 places, leaned the posts at angles that had stopped being charming and started being structural problems. Reed had been meaning to fix it since August. Now the grass was still wet from the night before, and the sky was pale gray going pink at the edges, and he was out there at 6 in the morning with a post-hole digger, because the work didn't care about his schedule, and neither did the weather. He worked without the radio, without talking to himself, just the weight of the digger in his hands and the cold biting through his gloves, and the soft thud of boots on wet ground. 3 years since his father died. 3 years and the farm still ran. The cows still needed water. The fences still rusted. The hay still had to come in before the rain. The work didn't pause for grief. It just kept showing up, same as always, and Reed had learned to be grateful for that. Grateful the way a man gets grateful for things that don't ask him to feel anything. Just do. He'd gotten good at just doing. He pressed the digger into the earth near the first failing post. The ground gave. He worked the handle back and forth, pulling up dirt in slow, even scoops. The cows were up in the north pasture. He could hear them moving somewhere behind the tree line, low, unhurried sounds, the kind that said nothing was wrong, nothing was wrong. He was fixing a fence. That was all. He was almost done with the first post hole when he heard it. A soft, businesslike clucking from somewhere to his right. He straightened up. Looked, there she was. A brown hen, round in the way of a hen that had never missed a meal. She'd pushed through the gap where the old wire had sagged lowest and was now standing on his side of the line with 1 foot lifted. Considering her next move. Very deliberately, Reed knew this chicken. This was the 3rd time this week. He stood with the diggers in his hands and looked at her. She looked back, cocked her head, pecked at the grass once, then looked up again like she was waiting for him to say something worth hearing. He set the digger down. "Keep it up," he muttered. And I'm charging rent. A voice came from the other side of the fence. She's not trespassing. He turned. Della Whitmore stood on her side of the property line, with one hand resting on a post. Brown hair pulled back loose at the back of her neck, a few strands working free and sticking to her cheek in the morning damp. She wore a faded red plaid shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, jeans with a smear of dark soil across the right knee, old boots, good boots, the kind that had done real work for real years. She didn't look like she'd rushed out here. She looked like she just happened to be passing. She's checking, Della said, whether your fence deserves respect. Raid looked at the hen, then at Della. She's standing on my land. Della tilted her head. Almost the same angle as the chicken. Your land, she said, is sitting right where my chicken thinks the line should be. He opened his mouth, closed it. He couldn't find the edge of that argument. There wasn't one. She'd built the sentence like a fence herself. Tight, no gaps, nothing to get through. He tried anyway. If your chicken has that many opinions about property lines, he said, the least you could do is teach her to read a survey map. Della stepped through the gap in the wire, crouched down in one smooth motion, gathered the hen up without any fuss. The bird didn't protest, just settled against Della's chest with the ease of an animal that had done exactly what it came to do. Della straightened up, or, she said, you could learn something from her. Sometimes a line is just a line. Doesn't mean you have to stay on your side of it. She turned and walked back through the gap, didn't look back. Reed stood with the post-hole digger at his feet and the forgotten thermos on the tailgate and the sun just clearing the tree line. He watched her go. The way she moved through the tall grass, feet placed like she knew exactly where the ground was. The hen tucked against her like it belonged there. He watched until she disappeared behind the trees at the edge of her garden. Then he picked up the digger and went back to work. He set the new post, tamped the dirt, stretched the wire and fastened it. Good work. Solid. The kind that would hold through winter. When he finally reached for the thermos, the coffee was cold. He drank it anyway. And he did not think about the way she'd walked back through those trees. Not once. The cow's name was Rosie. She was 3 years old, brown and white, and she had recently developed a habit of testing every gate latch on the south pasture with her nose until she found one that gave. She wasn't mean. She wasn't even particularly ambitious. She just liked to see what was on the other side of things. Raid found her 4 days after the chicken incident, standing in the middle of Della's vegetable garden, specifically in the squash, the young squash. The ones that had been planted late and were only just coming in. A whole row of them, and Rosie was working through it with the calm efficiency of an animal that had found something good and saw no reason to rush. Della was already there when Reed came over the fence, hands on her hips, studying Rosie with the expression of a woman trying to decide whether she was more irritated or amused. When she heard Reed's boots on the ground, she turned. Your cow, she said, ate a third of my squash. Rosie kept chewing. Raid looked at the cow, at the damage, at the row of plants, some tipped over, some simply gone. Then he looked at Della. She's got good taste. Della stared at him. Is that an apology? That's a compliment. About your squash. She stared at him for another second. Then she laughed. Short and real, the kind that escapes before you can think to stop it. She pressed her lips together after, like she was mildly annoyed at herself for it. He offered to pay for the damage. She waved it off. He insisted. Twice what the plants were worth. She took the money without arguing, which told him she was more upset than she'd let on. Because Della Whitmore didn't take money she didn't need to take. He got Rosie back through the fence, fixed the latch, added a second one for good measure, That evening he heard boots on his porch steps. He opened the door. Della stood there holding a paper bag, the top folded over twice. She held it out. "The squash that survived," she said. "Didn't want you missing out just because your cow got there first." He took the bag. "You're bringing vegetables to the man whose cow robbed your garden." She shrugged. "I didn't want you thinking your cow has better taste than you." She smiled when she said it. Not the one she gave people at the feed store. Polite, friendly, meaning nothing in particular. This was the other one. Smaller. The kind that reached her eyes and stayed there. Reed felt something shift in his chest. He didn't have a name for it yet. He asked if she wanted to come in for a minute. She said she had horses to feed. She stayed long enough to drink half a glass of water and tell him that Rosie had looked deeply pleased with herself the entire time she was eating. After Della left, Reed stood in the kitchen for a moment. The paper bag sat on the counter. Her half-empty glass sat by the sink. He left it there, didn't wash it until the next morning. The excuses started the following week. He'd be the first to admit that. He found the pair of pliers she'd left on his fence post. She'd been over helping him check the new wire, nothing unusual, and drove them over the next afternoon. 4 minutes round trip. Could have waited until he saw her. He drove over anyway and told himself it was practical. He stopped by one morning to ask what time the farmer's market opened on Saturday. The schedule was printed on the sign at the end of her driveway. He'd driven past that sign twice that week. He stopped and stood on her porch for 10 minutes talking about the weather. The storm was supposed to miss them. It probably wouldn't. That turned into a conversation about the old tractor in her barn that had been giving trouble since July. Whether the part she'd ordered would actually fit. Reed ended up looking at the engine for 20 minutes while Della handed him tools, and they argued about whether the problem was the carburetor or the fuel line. It was the fuel line. He was right. She admitted it. But in a tone that suggested she was granting him this one, and had no intention of it becoming a pattern. He drove home thinking about that. About the way she'd handed him a wrench without him asking, like she already knew what he needed next. About the way she'd laughed when he got grease on his sleeve. About how 20 minutes had become an hour and a half, and he hadn't noticed until he was almost home. One afternoon toward the end of September, he saw her through the tree line. Out in the garden, trying to stake the tomato plants before a line of storms came through. By herself. The plants were heavy, with late fruit, and the stakes weren't holding, and she was moving fast. He didn't think about it, he just went. Showed up with extra stakes and twine from the barn. No explanation, she didn't ask for one. They worked side by side for 40 minutes until every plant was secured and the first drops of rain hit the leaves. She handed him sweet tea afterward and a piece of cornbread still warm from the oven. He stood on her porch in the rain and ate the cornbread and didn't think about leaving. She never called him on any of it. The pliers, the market hours, the tractor, the stakes. She just kept letting him a little further in each time, like she was opening a door 1 inch per visit and waiting to see what he'd do with the opening, he noticed. He just hadn't decided what to do about noticing. It was during that same last week of September that Bev Slade first mentioned Grant Tully. Ray had come into the feed store for a bag of mineral supplement, nothing urgent. And Bev was behind the counter with the expression she wore when she had information she was going to share whether you asked for it or not. "There's a man been coming around," she said. "Land company out of the next county. Buying up small farms on this side of the highway. Offering good money, real good money." She paused. "Name's Grant Tully. Heard he went out to the Whitmore place this week. Raid set the supplement on the counter. What kind of money? Bev named a number. He was quiet for a second. That's close to 3 times market rate. Close enough, Bev said. He paid and drove home and told himself it was just local news. People sold land. People bought land. It happened. The Whitmore place was Della's business, and Della was a grown woman who handled her own affairs without any input from him. He told himself that he mostly believed it. But that evening he sat on his porch longer than usual. And when he looked across the fields and saw the light in her kitchen window, something about it felt different than it had before. Not softer, sharper, more specific. Like something he hadn't known he was counting on until someone mentioned it might not always be there. He went inside without deciding what to do about that feeling. The following Thursday, Bev mentioned it again at the feed store. He came in for cattle cubes and fence staples, and Bev was in the doorway with her arms crossed and that same look she'd worn when she'd first said the name. "You've been over at the Whitmore place a lot lately," she said. "All that fence work and helping out." Reed set the last bag in the truck bed. Fence needed work. Just being neighborly, Bev smiled. The smile of a woman who had been running this store for 30 years and had heard every version of that sentence. She said. The fence, and the tractor, and the tomatoes. Very neighborly. Then more quietly, "Tully went back out there again, you know." Second visit, Raid nodded and got in the truck and drove home. The comment sat in the passenger seat the whole way back, because she was right about both things. The reasons were getting thinner every week, and Grant Tully had been to Della's place twice now, and Reed still hadn't done anything about the feeling that had started the first time Bev said his name. The water trough on Della's property gave out on a Wednesday evening in early October. The float valve had stuck, and the trough had run over, and by the time she caught it, the ground around the horse stall was 6 inches of mud. She'd already shoveled most of it by the time Reed came over. He'd seen the light in her barn burning past 9 from across the field and gone to check. No announcement, no reason given. He just showed up with boots and a spare valve he happened to have on the shelf. They worked without talking much. That was one of the things about being around Della. The silence never felt like something that needed filling. With most people, Reed felt the pressure of a quiet room like a hand on his chest. This low, constant push to say something, fill the air, prove he was present. With her, it was just space. Room to breathe. They worked until the sun dropped low and the fields went that soft gold color they get at the end of a clear October day, just before everything turns gray. When the mud was cleared and the new valve seated and the trough running clean, Della sat down on an overturned wooden crate near the stall door. Reed sat on the one beside it. They listened to the horses shifting in the stalls. The first crickets starting up somewhere in the far trees. The sounds of a farm settling into evening. After a while, Della looked out across the pasture toward his place. Small and quiet in the distance. "You ever feel like this place gets too quiet?" she asked. Raid looked at his boots. He'd planned to say no. He'd made his peace with quiet. No, it was fine. No, he preferred it. Sometimes, he said. She turned her head and looked at him. The light was going low. He couldn't read her expression fully. But her voice, when she spoke again, came out quiet and certain. The way she said things she'd already thought through. Getting used to being alone doesn't mean you like it. He didn't have an answer for that. He sat with his elbows on his knees and stared at the ground between his boots, and felt the truth of it land somewhere behind his ribs, in the place where he kept other things he hadn't gotten around to dealing with yet. She was right. He'd been telling himself for 3 years that he'd made his peace, that the farm was enough, that he was the kind of man who didn't need more than what he already had. But sitting here next to Della, with the smell of wet earth and horse, and the last warmth of the evening still in the air, he wanted to say something. He wanted to ask her if she left the radio on in her kitchen at night, not because she was listening, but because she needed another voice in the rooms. He wanted to tell her that lately the only thing that made the quiet at his place feel bearable was knowing she was over here, moving around her house, probably talking to the horses like they understood every word and were keeping it to themselves. He didn't say any of it, just nodded once, slow. Kept looking at the ground. Della didn't push. She sat with him until the first stars came out. Then she stood, brushed off her jeans, and said it easy. "Thanks for the help, Reed. Drive safe." He drove home with the windows down. The air smelled like cut grass and rain still sitting in the ground, somewhere north of them. He pulled into his own yard and sat in the truck for a minute with the engine off. He didn't tell himself it was nothing this time. He just sat there and looked at nothing, and finally let himself understand that something was already happening, had been happening for weeks, and that the only person who hadn't been willing to call it by its name was him. He went inside. He didn't turn the radio on, not to fill the silence. Not to pretend. He left the porch light on, just in case. It was the second mention from Bev, that Thursday in late September, that finally made the name land the way it should have the first time. Reed had come in for a float valve and fence staples. The south trough had been sticking, and Bev had told him Tully had been back. Second visit to the Whitmore place. He'd paid and driven home and put the valve in the barn and hadn't gotten to it that afternoon because he couldn't stop turning the information over. 2 visits. He knew Della's situation. Not because she'd told him directly. She wasn't the kind to lay out her problems for someone else to look at, but because he'd been paying attention whether he'd meant to or not. The markets stand open every single weekend regardless of weather. The way she'd hesitated before taking the squash money, and then taken it without arguing. The equipment she kept running instead of replacing. The particular quiet she had sometimes in the evenings that wasn't peace so much as management. Keeping things in their compartments, not letting anything spill. She was carrying something she hadn't told him about. That much he'd understood for weeks. What he hadn't let himself understand was what it would mean if someone came along and offered to take that weight off her hands. Someone with the means to do it cleanly. No complication. Just a number on paper and a way out. He drove the back road home that evening instead of the main one. Slower. Past the east edge of her property, where you could see the house and the barn and the long row of the kitchen garden from the road. He didn't stop, but he slowed down enough that stopping would have been easier. When he got home, he went inside without sitting on the porch. No looking across the field that night. No watching the kitchen light. Because he understood now that looking at it had become something more than habit, and staring at a thing you're scared of losing wasn't the same as doing something about it. He needed to figure out what to do about it. That was the night he stopped leaving the porch light on, not because he'd given up, because leaving it on had started to feel like a question, and he needed to figure out how to ask that question properly before he did anything else. The fair came to town the last weekend of October. It wasn't much. Never had been. A few rows of vendor tables outside the community hall, a country band on a plywood stage that leaned slightly left and had for years. Long folding tables covered with casseroles and pies, galvanized tubs of lemonade sweating in the cool air, kids running between people's legs, The smell of cinnamon and wood smoke from the corner heater. Reid hadn't planned to go. Walt showed up at his door at 7 on Saturday evening, leaned against the truck with his arms crossed, and said it flat. "You're going. Change your shirt." Reid said he had things to do. Walt looked at the barn, at the porch, at the coffee in Reid's hand. Name one. Reid couldn't name one that would hold up under examination, so he changed his shirt. He noticed something in the truck on the way over. Walt drove and didn't say much, which was normal. But twice Reid caught him glancing sideways with the expression Walt used when he was sitting on something. Not quite a look of concern. More the look of a man who has information and is waiting to see if the situation resolves itself before he has to use it. Reid didn't ask. He'd been not asking Walt a lot of things lately, and Walt had been not offering them. That was their arrangement, and it had worked for 22 years. But tonight the silence in the truck had a different weight to it. Like something was in the cab with them that neither of them was ready to name yet. He arrived late on purpose. The hall was already warm and loud, full of the noise of a small town that only gets this many people in one room a few times a year. He stood in the doorway and let his eyes adjust. That was when he saw her. Della was near the lemonade table in a simple blue dress with small white flowers on it. Hair pulled back halfway, loose strands at her neck. Her brown boots, not the garden pair, a cleaner set but still boots, still entirely herself. She hadn't tried to be someone different for the evening. She didn't need to be. She was laughing at something Ruth Pierce had just said. Reid heard it across the room, over the band, over the crowd and the clink of glasses and the kids near the dessert table. He heard her laugh over all of it, and stopped walking because he hadn't known that. Hadn't known he'd learned the sound of her laugh well enough to find it in a crowded room the way you find a frequency you've been tuned to for weeks without realizing it. Hadn't known that was something that could happen to a person without them making a decision about it. Walt's elbow hit his ribs. "You're staring." "I'm looking, Reid." Walt's voice was dry. "You look like you're about to buy the building." Reid walked toward the lemonade. He heard Walt laughing quietly behind him, the particular laugh Walt used when he was right about something and was saving it. Della saw him before he reached the table. She lifted her cup, the small greeting she gave when they passed on the road. Not quite a wave. "Just I see you. You actually came," she said when he got close. "I had you down as a firm no. I asked the cows. They said I should get out more." She smiled into her cup. "First time I've ever agreed with your cows." They stood there talking the way they always did, easy, sideways. The band was playing something slow and the room was warm, and Reid was aware, more than usual, of how close they were standing. Not close. Just closer than necessary. He noticed a lot of things he'd been keeping at the edge of his vision. Then Grant Tully walked over. Reid had seen him earlier. Across the room near the door, talking to a few of the older farmers who always stood in the same spot at every community event, like they'd been assigned those coordinates at some point in the past and never updated them. Grant was tall, clean-shaved. He wore a good flannel shirt and boots that were newer than his handshake suggested he was. He moved through the room the way some men move through rooms, like the space had been expecting him. He came over and smiled at Della the way a man smiles at a woman he's been thinking about. Direct, warm, no performance in it. "Della," he said, "would you like to dance?" Simple, honest. The question of a man who knew what he wanted and saw no reason to be indirect about it. Della didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved to Reid, just for a second. A glance that lasted less than a breath. But it carried weight. It asked something. Reid didn't know exactly what it was asking. He didn't know what the right answer was. He stood there with his cup of lemonade and the warm room around him and Della looking at him for that one brief moment, and he said the stupidest thing he'd said in 32 years. "Go on," he heard his own voice, easy and careless. "At this rate, you'll never get married. You've got to take a chance when it shows up." He thought she'd roll her eyes. He thought she'd come back sharp, the way she always did when he said something she found ridiculous. He thought they'd laugh about it later, over coffee by the fence, some morning when it was already a story instead of something still happening. Della didn't laugh. She looked at him, and something in her face changed. Not anger, not quite hurt. Something quieter than both. A kind of stillness that pushed the noise of the room back, until it felt like just the two of them standing in a space that no one else could hear into. She stepped closer, close enough that her voice was only for him. "Only if you ask me." Then she turned to Grant. Warm, unhurried. "Thank you," she said, "but I think I'll sit this one out." And she walked toward the dessert table without looking back. Reid stood there. Grant glanced between Reid and Della's retreating back, confused in the polite way of a man who knew he'd missed something but couldn't find the edges of it. "What was that about?" he asked. Reid watched her move through the crowd, the way the light fell across her shoulders, the way she held her cup, the easy, certain way she moved through people. "Go ask someone else," Reid said. He left not long after, didn't find Walt, didn't say goodbye to anyone, walked out the side door into the cold October night and just kept going. Down the road, away from the parking lot. His truck sat where he'd left it. He didn't go back for it. He walked. The air was cold enough to sting. October gone deep into itself now. The trees along the road stripped down to their bones. The fields on either side flat and dark. The grass beaten down from the week's first frost. His breath came out in small white bursts and vanished. He walked with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the road ahead. "Only if you ask me," he heard it again, exactly the way she'd said it. Low, steady, close enough that only he could have caught it. "Only if you ask me." He went back over every excuse he'd made since September. The chicken, the fence, the pliers on the post, the market hours printed on the sign he'd driven past twice that week, the tomato steaks, the water trough, all of it, every reason he'd invented to cross that field, every thin, transparent excuse he'd used to be near her without having to name why he wanted to be near her. And tonight, when it actually mattered, go on. At this rate, you'll never get married. He closed his eyes for one step, opened them. What kind of man says that? What kind of man watches a woman look at him? Actually look at him? Actually wait? And responds by handing her off to someone else with a smile like it cost him nothing. Like 6 weeks of showing up at her door hadn't meant anything. Like the glass she'd left by his sink that he hadn't washed for 12 hours had meant nothing. Like the fact that he'd started driving the long way home from town just to pass her property line had meant nothing. He stopped in the middle of the road. The fields were empty in every direction. No cars, no sound except wind through bare branches, and somewhere far off a dog barking twice and going quiet. He could see his own breath, could feel the cold working through his jacket and down into his collar. He looked back toward the faint lights of town. Then he turned and looked the other way, and there it was. Across Cardique fields and a line of trees, a small yellow light, warm and steady. Her kitchen window. He stood in the road and looked at it. He'd been looking at that light for weeks. From his porch, from his yard, from the cab of his truck after he pulled in at night and didn't quite want to go inside yet. He'd told himself every time that it was nothing, just the natural awareness of a neighbor's house nearby, just the way a man's eyes went to the only light in a dark field. Told himself it was habit, proximity, nothing that needed a name. He'd been lying to himself. He understood that fully now. Standing in the middle of a cold dirt road at 10 o'clock at night, with his truck sitting in a lot a mile behind him, and the sound of her voice still right there inside his chest, where it had landed and stayed, he was in love with her. That was what this was. He'd probably been in love with her since the morning she'd picked up that chicken and told him his fence needed to earn its respect. Maybe before that. Maybe from the evening she'd shown up at his door with a bag of squash and a joke about his cow's taste, and stayed long enough to drink half a glass of water and leave something in the room that didn't go away after she did. He'd known. He just hadn't been willing to call it what it was, because naming it made it real. And real things could be lost. Real things left a specific shape of absence when they were gone, and his father had been gone 3 years and he still felt that shape every morning before he was fully awake. He did not want another one, so he'd used his own slowness like a fence post. Driven it in deep, stood behind it, told himself it was practical, and tonight he'd pointed that fence post at her. He started walking again, faster this time. He didn't sleep. The house was quiet in the way it got when the person inside it wasn't resting. He lay on his back in the dark and looked at the ceiling, and every time he came close to sleep, he heard her voice again. Low, clear, meant only for him. Only if you ask me. By 4 in the morning he gave up on the bed. He got up, made coffee, drank half a cup standing at the kitchen window looking at the dark fields. The sky was starting to go slightly less black at the edges. Not light yet. Just the first suggestion that light was considering it. He went to the barn at first light, fed the cows, checked the water, found himself standing in the middle of the barn 10 minutes later with a bucket in his hand and no memory of why he'd picked it up. By 7 he was loading the truck. The southeast corner of Della's fence had been soft since August. He'd noticed it every time he drove past. He'd thought about mentioning it twice and found other things to say. Thought about going over to fix it twice and found other things to do. Today there was nothing else to do. He loaded a new post, the digger, a roll of wire, the toolbox. Drove the 1/4 mile down the road to her property line and pulled up on the grass just after 8 in the morning. Della was in the garden behind the house. He could see her from the road, bent over the cold weather kale, checking what had made it through the October frost. She straightened when she heard the truck, wiped her hands on her jeans. Her eyes went to the post in the truck bed, the digger. Then to him she waited. Southeast corner's been soft since August, Reed said. I'm fixing it. She looked at the corner in question. I know, I was going to get to it. I'm here now. A beat of silence. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more careful than that. She looked at the tools in the truck one more time. Then she went back to the garden, and Reed went to the fence. The ground was cold. It took longer than it should have. His hands weren't steady the way they usually were when he worked. He kept setting down the wrong tool, stopping for no reason. Staring at the post hole like it owed him something, he knew why. He was getting ready to say something true. And he'd never been good at that, not with the things that mattered. He could tell a cow had a bad foot before she was limping. He could hear a water pump losing pressure before it failed. He could fix almost anything broken on this land. Saying what was broken inside himself was a different skill entirely. He'd never practiced it. After almost an hour, Della came out with 2 mugs of coffee. She didn't say anything, just held one out. He took it. She sat on the low wooden rail along the inside of the fence line and looked out at the pasture. He finished setting the post, tamped the earth down solid, stretched the wire and secured it. Then he sat on the rail beside her. They drank the coffee. The fields were pale in the morning light. A few crows moved through the far tree line unhurried. Somewhere behind the barn, one of her horses made the soft sound horses make when they're not asking for anything. Just present. The silence between them had weight, not uncomfortable, but full. Like something had been sitting in it for a long time, getting heavier, and both of them could feel how heavy it had gotten. Reed set his mug down on the rail. "I've been thinking," he said. "About last night." Della kept her eyes on the pasture. "Have you?" Her voice was perfectly calm. She wasn't going to reach across and help him with this. She'd done her part. She'd said what she had to say, simply and clearly and only once. Now it was his turn, and she was going to let him take all the time he needed. But she was not going to do it for him. That was fair. More than fair. He looked down at his hands, dirty from the post, a few small cuts from the wire, hands that were good at fixing things directly in front of them. He started, "Anyway, I've been lying to myself," he said, "for a while now. Every time I came over here, the pliers, the market hours, the tractor, the tomato stakes, I told myself it was just being a good neighbor. I told myself if I didn't give it a name it would stay simple. I could keep showing up without making it into something that could go wrong." He stopped, looked at the ground, and last night. "When he asked you to dance, I said that." A short silence. "That was bad," Della said. "It was the worst thing I've said in years." "That's a high bar." He almost smiled. Didn't quite get there. He kept his eyes on the dirt between his boots and kept going. "I look across the field every night to see if your light is on. Not out of habit. Because I want to know you're there. I argue with you because it's the best part of my day. And last night when he asked you, I hated it. I didn't have any right to hate it. But I did. Because it should have been me asking. And it wasn't because I was scared. And I'm done being scared of something good." Della was quiet. He finally looked at her. Her face had opened. The careful, measuring look she wore when she was deciding how much to give away. That was gone. She was looking at him directly. And in her eyes there was something that took him a moment to name because he hadn't seen it aimed at him before. Hope. And underneath it, just visible, a trace of the hurt he'd put there last night with 5 careless words. He felt that land exactly where it deserved to. "I don't want to just be the man who fixes your fence anymore," he said. "I want to come over properly, take you to dinner, do this right, the way a man should when he's serious, because I am serious. I should have said that a long time ago. I'm sorry for the part of last night that came from me not saying it sooner." Della looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "Is that your way of telling me you like me, Reed Harlow? If you need it to sound better, I'll try again." She shook her head. The real smile came back, small and warm and reaching all the way. "No, it's clumsy and straightforward. Sounds exactly like something you'd say right after setting a fence post." He made a face. "That bad? It's very you." She held his eyes. "So I like it." Something in his chest that had been pulled tight since September loosened, all at once like a knot that had been waiting for exactly the right moment to let go. She picked up her coffee, took a slow sip, looked at him over the rim. "I'm free Friday," she said. "Dinner?" She nodded once. "But Reed, yeah, if it takes you another 6 weeks to decide whether this is a date, I'm calling it a date right now, Good. Because I was going to let the chicken move into your barn." He laughed, real and uneven, the kind of sound that comes out when a person has been holding something tight for too long and finally puts it down. Della was smiling at him. Not the polite version. Not the one she gave strangers at the market stand, but the one he'd been storing up, in the back of his memory since September, like something he didn't want to forget. She picked up both mugs and walked back toward the house. He sat on the fence rail in the October morning with dirty hands and a chest that felt about 10 pounds lighter than it had the night before. He didn't tell himself it was nothing. What he didn't know, sitting on that fence rail in the thin morning sun, feeling like a man who'd made it through a door just before it closed, was that he'd come closer to being too late than he understood yet. Walt told him that evening. Reed had gone home and done actual work for the first time in days. Cleaned the south water line, fixed the hay barn gate that had been dragging since August. The steady, satisfying work of a man whose head had finally cleared. He was reorganizing the tool bench when Walt's truck pulled in. Walt came into the barn, sat on the sawbuck without being invited. That was how Walt operated. He didn't wait to be welcomed into a space. He arrived and said what needed saying. Tonight it was the second kind. You talked to her? Walt asked. Raid set down a socket wrench. This morning, and? She said yes. Dinner Friday. Walt nodded, the nod of a man confirming something he'd already expected. Then he said, You know about the loan. Reed looked at him. What loan? Walt was quiet for a moment, working out the order. Her father's, he said. Note on the property when he died. Equipment and land improvements, mostly. First payment came due last spring. Second one's due in December. She's been managing it, but 2 bad seasons back to back. The late frost in May took half her kitchen garden. Dry summer hit the hay yield hard. She didn't bring in what she needed either year. Reed set down what he was holding. How bad? Walt met his eyes. Bad enough that she called the bank in August. Bad enough that when Grant Tully showed up, twice, as you know, she didn't turn him down on the spot. Raid was very still. She was thinking about it, Walt said. Not because she wanted to sell. Because she did the math, and the math wasn't adding up. Tully's offer would have paid the loan and left her with enough to start fresh somewhere smaller. She didn't want that, but she was running out of other options. Raid thought about all of it. The market stand open every weekend, no matter the weather. The hesitation before she'd taken the squash money. The equipment she nursed along instead of replacing. The quiet behind her eyes some evenings that he'd noticed and not known what to call. Managing. She'd said it the same way every time. Fine. Managing. How long have you known? Reed asked. Walt looked at the floor. A few weeks. Since early October. Reed looked at him. I wanted to see what you'd do on your own, Walt said. If I'd told you back in October, you'd have gone over there with your checkbook and called it helping. And she'd have sent you home. And you'd both have ended up further apart than when you started, with something awkward sitting between you that neither of you asked for. Reed didn't argue, because Walt was right. A month ago, hearing that Della was in trouble, his first move would have been exactly that. Show up with money, not to hold it over her. Because it would have been a way to do something concrete without saying anything true. A way to help that didn't require being honest about why he wanted to help. And Della would have known that, and she would have closed the door, but knowing it now felt different. Knowing it now meant understanding what she'd been carrying while she handed him sweet tea, and argued about carburetors and sat beside him on that wooden crate watching the stars come out. What she'd been carrying while he took his time. Walt stood up. She didn't take the offer, he said. Called Tully last Thursday evening. Told him no. Raid looked up. That was 2 days before the fair. Walt nodded. Before you said anything to her. Before Saturday night. Raid let that settle fully. She'd already said no, not because of anything Reed had done, not because of any well-timed gesture or conversation on his part. She'd sat with the offer and the math and everything Grant Tully represented, the clean exit, the erased debt, the easier road, and she'd said no on her own, because she'd decided what she wanted to keep, and she'd kept it. He sat with that for a long time after Walt left. The barn was quiet around him. Through the open door, the sky had gone full dark, stars showing sharp in the cold October air. The fields were still. He thought about Della in her kitchen 2 nights ago, the same night she'd called Tully, as it turned out, making that decision alone, no one to talk it through with. Just herself and the math and what she knew about what she wanted. He thought about what she'd said this morning on the fence rail. I waited long enough to know you were real. He hadn't understood the full weight of that sentence until now. Friday, he thought. He was going to do this right. Friday came the way good things come when you've been waiting for them. Slow at first. Then all at once, Raid told himself he wasn't nervous. He said this Thursday afternoon while fixing a gate latch that didn't need fixing, and again Friday morning while reorganizing the tool bench he'd already reorganized Tuesday. Just dinner. Just 2 people who'd been talking across a fence for 2 months. Just the natural next step. He was nervous. He changed his shirt twice. The first one had a small stain near the left cuff he hadn't noticed until he was already at the truck. The second one was right. Dark blue. Clean. The kind of shirt that said he'd made an effort without advertising how much. He drove to Della's at 6. She was on the porch when he pulled up. Sitting in the wooden chair by the door, coat on, both hands around a mug like she was finishing something before he arrived. The porch light was on behind her. She looked up when she heard the truck. She was wearing a simple dark dress and a gray cardigan and her brown boots. Not the garden pair, a cleaner set. But still boots, still entirely herself good. He didn't want a different version of her. He'd been paying attention to exactly this version for 2 months. She stood when he reached the steps. You sound surprised, she considered. Cautiously optimistic. There's a difference. He smiled and she smiled back. And they walked to his truck in the cold November air like it was something they'd done before. Even though it wasn't, even though every part of it felt like stepping off a known edge into something new. The diner was small and warm and smelled like coffee and decades of good cooking. Red vinyl booths, a counter with swivel stools, half of them full, a neon sign in the window that had been there since before either of them was born. They took a booth near the back. The menus were laminated and sticky at the edges. Reed ordered the steak. Della ordered the same. Then the waitress asked about gravy. And that was the end of the easy part of the evening. The gravy here, Della said, is fine. Just fine. It's good gravy. It's acceptable gravy. Those are the same thing. They are absolutely not the same thing. The waitress. Young, patient, name tag reading Crystal, looked between them with the expression of someone who had taken a job to carry plates and had not prepared for this. She came back 3 times. They didn't notice either time. They argued about the gravy, then about the pie here versus the pie at the place on Route 9 that had closed 4 years ago and was still mourned by a solid portion of the county. Reed said the mourning was justified. Della said a restaurant's mourning period should max out at 2 years, and after that a person needed to move on. He said that was cold. She said that was practical. He said those weren't always different things. She looked at him over her water glass and said nothing, which meant he'd made a point she wasn't going to dispute out loud. He filed that away. The food came and they ate and the conversation moved the way it always did between them. Sideways, doubling back, picking up something from 20 minutes ago. About the farms, about winter, about the greenhouse heater she'd patched in September and whether it would hold through January. And then, between the steak and the pie, something shifted. Della set her fork down, looked at the table. She was quiet for a moment in a way that was different from her usual quiet. Not thinking something through, more like deciding whether to say it. Then she looked up. "I almost sold," she said. "In case you were wondering." He was quiet. She took a breath. Slow. The kind a person takes before saying something they don't say easily. "The loan was real," she said. "I want you to know that. I wasn't pretending to be okay. I was managing. And then managing stopped being enough. I had about 3 weeks in September where I sat at that kitchen table every night and ran the same numbers hoping I'd missed something somewhere." "Had you?" "No," she met his eyes. "The numbers were the numbers. Grant's offer would have covered everything. I would have walked away without any debt. Enough left over to start somewhere smaller. But you said no." I said no. He waited because, she said, "This is my father's land, and his father's before that. And I know that's not a financial argument. But I sat there one night and asked myself, if I sell, where do I go? And I couldn't picture it. I couldn't picture anywhere else. All I could picture was the greenhouse in the morning, the horses, the view from the back porch when the sun comes up over your fence line." She said your fence line like it was a fixed point on a map, like it had always been part of the landscape she was measuring from. He looked at his hands. "You should have told me," he said. "Why?" "Because I would have helped." She shook her head. "That's not why I'm telling you. I'm not telling you so you can fix it." She paused. "I'm telling you because you said the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 2 years, sitting on that fence rail this morning. And I think you deserve to know that I was scared too, that I had my own version of a fence I was sitting behind, deciding to stay. That was me choosing this place, choosing to keep going. Before Friday morning, before you said anything, before me," she held his eyes, "before you." Yes, he sat with that. The diner was warm around them. Someone at the counter laughed at something, and the sound bounced off the tile floor and faded. Outside, the main street was quiet. A stoplight cycling through its colors at an empty intersection, patient as anything. He reached across the table, his hand on the table close to hers. An offer, nothing more. She turned her hand over and took it. They stayed like that while the coffee cooled and Crystal came by one more time and quietly decided not to interrupt. He paid the check. Della didn't argue. He knew the evening had gone right because she didn't argue. November settled in properly after that. The last warm days were finished. The light came later every morning and left earlier every afternoon, turning everything golden and then gray by turns, the fields stripped down and still, the sky that wide, flat white that sits over Tennessee in November, not dramatic, just patient. Ready for whatever came next. Reed came over most evenings after his own chores were done, to help close up the horse stall. Practically speaking, she had 2 horses, and the work of shutting everything down for the night went faster with 2 sets of hands. That was how it started, but it stayed for other reasons. Because there was always something to talk about. Because the hour between finishing the barn and when a person reasonably had to leave was a good hour. An easy one. She came over twice a week to work on his books, his actual financial records, which, she informed him the first time she opened his ledger, appeared to have been maintained by someone operating under significant personal stress. "It's a system," he said. "It's a situation," she said. She sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his ledger and a red pen, and had 3 months of his accounts organized in under 2 hours, while he sat across from her and felt something he hadn't expected. Gratitude. Not the performative kind. Not the kind that needed to announce itself. The quiet kind that sits in your chest and doesn't go anywhere. She wasn't doing it to fix him. She was doing it because it needed doing and she was good at it. Same reason he helped with the horses. Same reason he'd gone over with extra stakes before the September storms. Not a transaction, not a debt being run up. Just two people who had started noticing what the other one needed and doing it without waiting to be asked. He didn't have a word for what they were yet. He was working on it. One Sunday they walked the full perimeter of both properties together. East fence to south to west and back, checking everything before the ground froze hard and the work got harder. It took most of the morning. They argued about 3 sections that Reed considered adequate and Della considered marginal. She was right about one of them. He fixed it while she watched. Told you, she said, you could act less pleased about it. Why would I do that? He had nothing for that one. They were walking back along the north line when Della stopped and looked out over both properties at once. His pasture, her greenhouse roof showing just above the rise, the creek that ran between their land catching the gray November light. It's a lot of ground, she said. For one person to manage. He looked at the same view. Yeah, for either person. He glanced at her. She was still looking at the fields, not at him. Like she was saying it to the land itself. He looked back at the fields. Yeah, he said. They stood there a moment without saying anything else. Not needing to. Some things didn't need to be named the first time they were said. Some things needed to be stood next to for a while until they found their right shape. They walked back to her barn in the gray morning light, and she made coffee, and they talked about the forecast for another hour, and when he finally drove home, he felt the kind of full that didn't have anything to do with food. The loan came due the first week of December. He knew because Walt mentioned it in passing on a Tuesday, dropped into a conversation about hay prices the way Walt dropped things. Sideways, leaving them for Reed to pick up or not. Reed sat with it for 2 days. On the 3rd day he drove over on a Thursday afternoon, called ahead, which he didn't usually do. Della said come over with a slight pause before it that told him she'd noticed the call. She was in the greenhouse when he arrived, moving down the row of cold weather seedlings with a small watering can, checking each one with the focused attention she gave everything she was responsible for. The greenhouse was warm. It smelled like damp soil and something green and alive in the middle of a gray December. She didn't stop when he came in, just made room for him to stand beside her. He waited until she reached the end of the row. I want to help with the loan, he said. She set the watering can down. Reid, I have the money. He kept his voice level. It's been sitting in an account since my father left me the property. I don't have much use for it. Let me help. Pay me back when you can, or don't. That part doesn't matter to me. Della looked at him. He waited. She picked the watering can up, set it back down. No, she said. He opened his mouth. Listen to me. Her voice was quiet, but there was nothing soft about it. What you just offered, I know where it came from. I know you meant every word of it. But if I take that money from you right now, this becomes something else. It becomes you holding my farm up and me owing you for it. And I won't do that to us. That's not what I want this to be. I'm not trying to make you owe me anything. I know you're not. That's not the point. She looked at him straight. The point is how it would feel. To me. To get up every morning and know that this place is still standing because of your account balance instead of my own work. I've been fighting to keep this land for 2 years, and I need to keep fighting for it myself. That matters to me. He was quiet. Her voice dropped slightly. I don't need you to rescue my farm, Reed. I need you to still be here. Not because you bought the right to be here, just because you want to be. He stood in the warm greenhouse with the smell of growing things around him, and looked at Della and understood something he hadn't entirely understood before tonight. There was a difference between loving someone and protecting them, between caring and taking over. He'd thought they were the same, that caring meant putting yourself between a person and the hard thing, removing it, paying for it if you had the means. He'd thought that was what you did. He'd been wrong. Caring for Della meant trusting her to carry what she could carry, trusting that she knew her own strength, and being beside her, not in front of her, not underneath her, beside her, and only stepping in when she actually asked. That was harder than writing a check. It required more patience. The willingness to watch someone walk through something difficult without reaching out to stop them just because you could. He could do that. He could learn to do that. Okay, he said. She looked at him. Just okay? Just okay. She studied him for a moment, then something in her face eased. I already worked it out with the bank, she said. Restructured the payment schedule. It's manageable now. Tight but manageable. I handled it last week. I know you did. Then why did you come over? Because I wanted you to know I would have. He held her eyes. If you'd needed it and asked. I wanted you to know that I'm not standing over here with my hands in my pockets while you carry everything alone. Whatever you need, whatever you'll let me do, I'm here for it. Della was quiet for a long moment, then she reached out and put her hand flat against his chest. Not reaching for him. Just there, grounded. Like making sure something was real. I know, she said. That's exactly why I said no. Because I knew you meant it. He put his hand over hers. They stood in the greenhouse while outside the December sky went the deep gray of late afternoon, and the cold pressed against the glass on all sides, and inside it was warm and green and alive. December settled over the valley the way it always did. Quietly and completely, the creek ran low under a thin shelf of ice at the edges. The pastures went hard underfoot. The mornings stayed dark until nearly 8, and the evenings were finished by 5, and the cold didn't lift between them, just sat there, steady and patient, the way cold did when it had decided to stay a while. Raid found he didn't mind it. He'd always gotten through winter alone before. Put his head down, worked, waited for March. Endurable, that was the word for it. The farm in winter was endurable if you didn't think too much about the length of the evenings. This winter was different. Because there were evenings in her kitchen. Because there were Sunday mornings when he drove over with coffee in a thermos, and they walked the frost-stiff fence line arguing about which sections needed work come spring. Because there was the sound of her voice in rooms that had been quiet for 3 years, and the way she left her coat on his porch hook without asking, and the specific way she said his name when she disagreed with him. Reed, with a slight lift at the end, patient but not backing down, that had somewhere along the way become his favorite sound. He told Walt, about time. Walt said, "That's all you've got?" Walt thought about it. Long overdue. Better than I expected from you overall. She's the best thing in your general vicinity, and you nearly let a man in clean boots walk off with her. I'm aware of that. Walt nodded once. Are you going to? Raid said. Yeah, Walt didn't ask when. He just nodded again and went back to his coffee. That was one of Walt's better qualities. Raid bought the ring on a Thursday morning in the second week of December. Drove 40 minutes to a jewelry shop in the next town, because he didn't want to run into anyone from home while he was doing it, and because the shop there had been recommended by someone whose name he couldn't remember now, but whose recommendation he'd held on to anyway. He stood at the glass counter for 20 minutes. He knew what he was looking for. He knew because he'd been paying attention. Della didn't wear jewelry much. The occasional small earring, nothing on her hands when she worked, which was always. She didn't want anything that would catch on things. She didn't want anything that said, "Look at what he spent." She would want something that said he knew her, that he'd been paying attention, and this was what paying attention looked like. He found it in the second tray the woman behind the counter showed him. Simple, flat-set stone, gold band, clean lines, nothing extra. Exactly right, he paid. Put it in his jacket pocket, left it there for 4 days, not because he was uncertain. He was certain. Had been certain for weeks, maybe since the morning he'd driven over with a fence post and found his hands unsteady the whole time he was digging. He was just waiting for the right morning. Not the right moment in some staged sense, not a restaurant, not an audience. Not anything that would make Della raise an eyebrow and say something sharp at exactly the wrong second, and turn the whole thing into a story they'd tell for years, but not the way he intended. Just the right morning. He'd know it when it arrived. It arrived on the 14th of December, clear sky, hard cold. The kind of still morning where sound carried further than usual, and the frost on the grass held the early light instead of giving it back. He drove over at 9 with coffee in the thermos. Her truck was in the yard. The kitchen light was on. The brown hen was already out in the yard, making her deliberate way across the frost-stiff ground with the air of an animal that had a schedule and kept it. Della opened the door before he knocked. She had her grey cardigan on over a flannel shirt, hair loose. The kind of morning where she'd been up for a while but hadn't felt any need to do anything about it. She looked at the thermos. "You brought coffee, mine's better." She stepped back and let him in. They took their cups out to the porch. Her idea. She tilted her head toward the door and he followed. The porch caught the morning sun in a narrow strip along the rail, cold in the shade, almost warm in the light. 2 chairs, 2 cups, her land stretching left and his stretching right, the fence line running between them the way it always had. The brown hen worked her way to the bottom of the porch steps and stopped. Looked up at them both, settled there like she'd arrived at a destination. "She's been out since before sunrise," Della said, waiting for something, Reed said. Della looked at him sideways. "Seems like it." They drank the coffee, talked about the forecast, real snow possibly by the weekend, about whether the South Road flooded when the ground thawed too fast in February, about the young mare that had been skittish since October. Easy talk, real talk. The kind that happened between 2 people who had stopped needing to perform anything for each other. Then Reed set his cup down on the arm of the chair. "Della," he said. She looked at him. Something in his voice had changed on that one word, something that landed. She sat up slightly, not alarmed, just present. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the ring. He looked at it for a moment. Small, flat-set stone, gold band, clean lines. Then he looked at her. "I thought about writing something out," he said. "Practicing it. You'd have seen through it in about 2 seconds. Probably less," she said. Her voice had gone quiet. "What I have instead is this." He held her eyes. "I want to argue with you about fences until I run out of things to argue about. I want every winter to be like this one. I want your coat on my porch hook. I want to be the person who knows what you need before you have to ask. And I want to do a good enough job at it that you never feel like you're carrying anything alone again." He held the ring out between them. "I'm asking you to marry me, Della. I know I was slow. I know it took longer than it should have. But I'm asking now, and I mean all of it." Della looked at the ring, then at him. She went still in a way he hadn't seen before. Not measuring, not guarded. Something that came from being surprised all the way down. Her eyes were bright. How long did it take you? She asked. Her voice wasn't quite level. 3 weeks. She made a sound, between a laugh and something that wasn't a laugh at all. She pressed her lips together, looked at the ring again. Raid Harlow, she said. 3 weeks. I wanted to get it right. She was quiet for a moment longer. Then she lifted her hand. It was shaking slightly. He noticed that, held it, set it somewhere inside him he knew he'd be able to find for the rest of his life. Della Whitmore, with her steady hands and her practical mind, and her 2 years of carrying everything alone, sitting on her own porch on a cold December morning, with her hand held out and her eyes full. He slid the ring onto her finger. The brown hen let out one sharp sound from the bottom of the steps. Decisive, final, the sound of a witness who had been present from the first morning and found the outcome correct. Della laughed, full and real and bright. She covered her mouth with her free hand for a second, eyes wet, still laughing. He pulled her into him. She came without hesitation, leaned her head against his shoulder. He felt the laughter ease into something quieter. Her hand on his chest, the ring cool against his jacket. I was starting to think, she said, her voice low, that I was going to have to ask you myself. He held her tighter. You never would have had to. A long moment of quiet. I know, she said. I know that now. The December light stretched long and flat across the porch. The hen walked a slow circle at the bottom of the steps, and then headed off toward the barn, her work there finished. Somewhere in the paddock one of the horses moved through the frost-stiff grass, unhurried. The fields ran out in both directions, pale and still and cold and wide open. Della turned the ring slowly with her thumb, back and forth, the small habit of a person getting used to something new. Raid watched the field. The fence line still ran where it had always run. Same posts, same wire he'd replaced in September on a Tuesday morning, when the only thing he'd been trying to do was fix something broken right in front of him. He hadn't known then what was already on the other side of it. He knew now.